Once upon a time, in a certain country, there was a village. All the villagers were simple and straightforward, but unfortunately, they were very poor. There was a reason for their poverty. They were a bit lazy and preferred comfort over hard work. They didn't put much effort or dedication into their work. If they felt like it, they went to work. If not, they wandered around idly. They enjoyed sitting in the shade of the trees at the village square, chatting with each other more than working. They were more interested in fairs and festivals than in their work. Because of these habits, they didn't earn much from their labor. Their poverty was also due to their lack of diligence. In the same village, there lived a very wealthy man named Rahmeth. He had a large mansion and many servants. He lived grandly with his wife and son. Rahmeth was very greedy, cunning, and selfish. He owned a lot of land but did not farm it. One might wonder how he became the richest man in the village despite not farming his land. The reason was that he lent money to the needy villagers at high interest rates. Suppose he lent someone 500 rupees. He would charge such high monthly interest that the principal amount remained unchanged, and the debtors spent their entire life paying off the interest. Despite Allah declaring interest haram, Rahmeth continued this practice, receiving a lot of money in interest over time. Those who failed to pay the interest were beaten by his henchmen. No one in the village thought well of him because his oppression caused them great distress. One day, after heavy rain, the village was drenched. The rain, which had been pouring for days, stopped for a while. A small dwarf, drenched, entered the village on his beautiful horse. He wore a red shirt, blue trousers, a long pointed hat of a yellow color, and colorful long shoes. He thought he would stay at an inn until the rainy season ended. His home was far away in fairyland, and traveling in the rain was very difficult. He wandered around looking for an inn. Suddenly, he saw a large crowd gathered in one place. It seemed to be the village square. Many people were standing in a circle. The dwarf went closer to find out what was happening. He saw Rahmeth's henchmen beating some poor villagers with whips. The poor villagers were crying out for mercy, but their pleas fell on deaf ears. Rahmeth was also present with his 4 or 5-year-old son, watching the spectacle. Seeing this, the dwarf immediately dismounted from his horse and made his way through the crowd to Rahmeth. Rahmeth saw him and said, "Hey dwarf, what are you doing here? Get out of here, or you'll be trampled underfoot. Why are you oppressing these poor people?" asked the dwarf in his sharp but thin voice. "Mind your own business. These people owe me money and they haven't even paid the interest, let alone the principal. That's why my servants are punishing them. If you interfere, I'll have my men beat you too," said Rahmeth arrogantly. The dwarf smiled and said, "You don't know me. If you did, you wouldn't say such things." "Why wouldn't I know you? You're just a little dwarf. If I want, I can grab you by the ears and throw you straight into the river," said Rahmeth. As soon as he finished speaking, the dwarf pulled out a small wand from his waist and pointed it at Rahmeth's 4 or 5-year-old son. The child rose into the air and hovered above the ground. The sudden incident frightened the child, and he began to cry loudly out of fear. Rahmeth was terrified upon seeing this. He shouted, "You scoundrel dwarf! You must be a magician. Put my son down, or I'll make sure you suffer." He signaled his henchmen, but they were too scared of the dwarf to move. They even dropped their whips. One of them said, "This dwarf is a magician. We won't touch him. If he turns us into animals, what will we do? The village children are so naughty. They throw stones at animals." Rahmeth was furious. "All right, cowards, I'll handle him myself." He lunged at the dwarf, but before he could reach him, the dwarf pointed his wand at Rahmeth and waved it lightly. Rahmeth floated into the air like a balloon and stopped near his son. His son clung to him and cried even louder. The villagers looked up at them in astonishment. realizing that the dwarf was a magician who had come to punish the cruel and greedy man. The dwarf mounted his horse and said, "Oh, greedy man, you'll stay up there. You've oppressed the helpless villagers too much. This is your punishment. I'm leaving now. It will start raining soon. Enjoy the rain." Rahmeth begged, "Have mercy, dwarf. You seem like a kind-hearted person. Why are you being so cruel to me? It's very cold, and if it starts raining, my son and I will suffer greatly. This isn't cruelty. It's your punishment for your actions. You've enslaved many innocent villagers by lending them small amounts and charging high interest. They've paid you much more than they borrowed, yet you don't spare them. Your child is innocent, so I'll let him down, but you'll stay up there," said the dwarf. With a wave of his magical wand, Rahmeth's son slowly descended to the ground. As soon as his feet touched the ground, he ran straight to his mansion, calling out for his mother. Rahmeth, helplessly suspended in the air, watched the dwarf leave. A while later, Rahmeth said, "Let me down. I'll give you so much wealth that you'll live in luxury for the rest of your life. I don't want wealth accumulated by sucking the blood of the poor and collecting their curses. You're very cunning. You lend money to the needy and charge such high interest that the principal amount remains the same, and they spend their lives paying the interest. When they can't pay due to their poverty, you have your henchmen punish them," said the dwarf, looking at the whips on the ground. With a wave of his wand, the whips rose and started beating Rahmeth's henchmen, who had earlier beaten the poor villagers. Their painful cries filled the air. The onlookers were amazed and happy, blessing the dwarf for his actions. When the henchmen were half dead from the beating, the whips turned towards Rahmeth and started beating him. Rahmeth had never been beaten before. Now, he was crying loudly from the pain. The villagers clapped in joy, seeing his condition. Just then, Rahmeth's wife came running and pleaded with the dwarf, "For God's sake, stop this cruelty on my husband. If something happens to him, who will lend money to the poor villagers? It would be good if something happens to him. Borrowing is not a good practice. I live in fairyland, where people consider borrowing shameful. They work so hard that they earn well from their labor. When there's no one to lend money, the villagers will work harder to earn more. They will understand the value of money and avoid unnecessary expenses and ceremonies, saving their hard-earned money for genuine needs, so they won't have to beg from anyone in times of need," said the dwarf. The villagers who had borrowed from Rahmeth felt ashamed. They realized that if they hadn't wasted time idly and had worked continuously, they wouldn't have needed to borrow money. They vowed to work hard and never take loans again. Rahmeth's wife looked helplessly at her husband. Rahmeth begged, "Get me out of this trouble. I promise to return all the interest money I've taken from the villagers. I'll forgive their debts. If they ever need money, I'll lend it to them without any interest. I remember now that interest is haram. I have a lot of land. I'll stop this interest business and start farming to earn halal income." Seeing that Rahmeth had reformed, the dwarf waved his magical wand and brought Rahmeth back to the ground. Rahmeth rushed home and returned all the money he had unjustly taken from the villagers. The villagers were happy. They thanked the dwarf. There was a small, clean, and beautiful inn in the village. The dwarf went to that inn. When the rainy season ended, the dwarf bid farewell to the villagers and returned to fairyland, where his home was. The villagers were sad to see him go. Since that day, no one in the village has ever borrowed money for their needs. They worked harder, earned more money, and became prosperous.